Okay, it's time to start. Thank you all very much for attending. So first of all, let me wish you a very good evening or good afternoon for some of you, and definitely for at least one of us as you're here later, good morning. My name's Frank Puranik. You can't see it on the list of panelists because I'm not a panelist. I'm your host for this event. And you'll have noticed that my emails have been part of the automatic system that's been coming to remind you about this. You'll have also noticed they come from someone called iTrinergy as an organization. So that's the company I work for, which has very kindly loaned us the use of their Zoom webinar system to run this event. So as I said, I'm the host for this event on Sir Theodore Chambers, Welwyn Garden City's third man, as we've advertised. And when we say third man, not in any manner at all to be confused with Harry Lime of Graham Greene's book. The first thing I'd like to do is to introduce our panelists for today. We have from the Welwyn Garden City Heritage Trust, its chairman, Tony Skottowe, who will be starting off with a quick introduction to the talk. The main talk will be done by Geoffrey Hollis, who is a member of the 20th Century Society and has done all of the research for this event. Coming to us from Hawaii, as you can see here, so definitely good morning to you, Quintin, is Quintin Chambers, the grandson of Sir Theodore Chambers. And last and absolutely not least is David Fraser, an independent councillor for Aird and Loch Ness Ward in the Highland Council. And you're going to ask what Loch Ness and Aird has to do with this, and all will be revealed. This talk is being recorded, so if you'd like to come back to it and watch it again, or any of your family would, or friends, or perhaps people you know who couldn't attend this, it will be available recording, and you'll get that in a few days' time when we've edited that, made it available. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Tony Skottowe, Chairman of the Welwyn Garden Heritage Trust, for the introduction. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, and greetings everybody from Welwyn Garden City, wonderful Welwyn Garden City. This talk is the second in our planned series, exploring the lives and contributions of the key figures in the creation of the second Garden City, visualised by Ebenezer Howard. This is a virtual talk via Zoom, a first for the Trust. The great advantage of Zoom is the significant increase in the size of the audience we can reach, the chance to see our overseas friends, particularly in this instance, and access to many more technical gizmos than normal. A dedicated team of trustees and supporters has brought this talk together, but our special thanks go to Frank Puranik, who is hosting the event for us. However, it is Geoffrey Hollis to whom we are most indebted for his long and detailed research into the life of Sir Theodore Chambers, who lived and worked for Welwyn Garden City as chairman of the board of the Welwyn Garden City Company for 30 years. We hope this talk will go some way to counter the neglect of this man, whom I like to call the maker, our third man, who, with Ebenezer Howard, the visionary, and Louis de Soissons, the designer, brought together Welwyn Garden City into the thing that it is now today. Now it gives me great pleasure to ask Geoffrey Hollis to tell us the story of Sir Theodore Chambers.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you. There's about 200, well, there's 125 screens, so quite a few more people. And I'd like to thank everyone that's taken the trouble to switch on this evening. I'd like to thank particularly Frank Puranik, whose dulcet tones you've just heard, and who's done all the technical work, which was quite considerable to organising one of these webinars. So, Sir Theodore Chambers. When I was asked to do this, I knew as much about him as probably most people in Welwyn Garden City, which is not a lot. But I now, after quite a lot of work, have learned a lot more, and he's a very fascinating person. And I hope I can get over to you how fascinating he is. Most people in Welwyn Garden City would have seen this, which is the monument to him at the top of Parkway, quite an impressive monument. Tony mentioned that he's the third man. Well, there's obviously the first man is Ebenezer Howard, whose statue has recently been installed at the top of Howard's Gate. by Ben Twiston Davies, a very fine statue, I think. The second man is Louis de Soissons, who has been condemned to stare eternally out over Parkway. I gave a talk on him a couple of years ago now, I suppose, and that I follow the same techniques on this one. So what are we going to do? We're going to have a short CV of Sir Theodore, then his family background, which in this case is important, I believe, the early years of his life, in World War I, which is where he got his knighthood, and finally we come to Welwyn Garden City, and lastly his resting place. And then at the end of that we'll throw it open to the other panelists and to hear from them. Short CV. Born in 1871, fourth son of Charles and Margaret Chambers, and he had 2 sisters, so 6 children. His father died young, age 50, in 1876, and unusually for that period his mother remarried and then had another 2 children, 2 brothers. Theodore studied at the Royal College of Science, first in Bristol, then in London, mining, but he requalified for reasons which I'll explain in 1895. 1896 he married Georgina Sandeman, known as Gina in her family, and had 2 sons, Theodore, Gervase, because Theodore would be confusing, he was always known as Gervase, and Holroyd, otherwise known as Roy. 1914 he stands for Parliament, but doesn't get anywhere because the war breaks out and they abolish elections. 1918, as a result of his great efforts during the war in promoting war savings, he's made a knight. 1920, he becomes chairman of Welwyn Garden City, which is where we know him from, and he's the first chairman, and then he ends up being the last chairman because in 1949 the Welwyn Garden City was wound up with him still in situ. And then a few years later he dies, aged 86, and he's buried in the Grant family graveyard near Loch Ness, and this is where David Fraser comes in. So, family background. For those who saw my talk on Louis de Soissons, you will recall that he purportedly was the second son of French aristocrats, the Count of de Soissons and the Countess. But I discovered through a bit of delving that in fact this was a complete con, because they were both from Poland. Anyway, this chap, Sir Theodore, has an absolutely marvellous background. Starting on his father's side, his father, Charles Harcourt Chambers, was born in India, and he was a barrister, and as I said, he died young, age 50. But he was not a very successful barrister, according to contemporary sources. However, his father, Sir Charles Harcourt Chambers, was a very successful lawyer. He became acting Chief Justice in Bombay. He was born in India, and unfortunately he was buried in Bombay because he died aged only 39, and so he's there today. And he was from a distinguished family because his brother, Sir William Chambers, also born in India, became the leading physician of the time, and he was physician to Queen Victoria, and this is him here. So Charles' wife was one Isabella Wilson, and this is important because she was descended from the Grants of Shugley. You'll find out all about them, the Scottish clan. And another thing that's important in the life story is that her maiden name was Wilson, and that props up again quite prominently. These 2 chaps came from William Chambers, who was known as Chambers of Calcutta. He is also buried in Calcutta, dying quite young. He was a skilled linguist, and he acted in the courts that his brother, Sir Robert Chambers, ran in Bengal. And this is a picture of Sir Robert Chambers by Reynolds. And they all descended from one Robert Chambers, who was an attorney in Newcastle. So you can see here, there's a lot of law, there's a lot of India, and there's some Scottish element as well. His mother's side, they were called the Hares of Hurstbourne Zoo, because she was Lady Caroline Isabella, who became known as Lucibella Hare. And she was an adventurous lady. Age 15, she was the first woman to climb Mont Blanc from one particular side. And she had a brother who was better known, probably the best known of this family in late Victorian times, because he was unfortunately the captain of a ship, the HMS Eurydice, which sunk off the Isle of Wight in a heavy gale because the design of the ship was faulty. She had too many sails on. He did most of the crew were lost with him, but he one of the survivors recalls that Captain Hare, being a good Christian, went down with the ship on the deck praying as it went down. And in fact, there's a lot of praying, because you'll see that this side of the Hare family, they come from Dr. Francis Hare, who was a Bishop of Chichester, and then a Reverend Hare Naylor, who was a canon of Winchester, and he inherited Hurstmonceux Castle. And that's why he added the Naylor, because it came from the Naylor side of the family. And then his son was Francis George Hare Naylor. He was quite an exciting person. He eloped with his wife, the painter Georgiana Shipley, who was a cousin of Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire. So this side is quite an exciting side of the family. Now, siblings. As I said, he was one of 6 children. His father may not have been a very successful barrister, but he was quite successful at producing children. And the oldest son became a farmer and magistrate in South Africa. The second son was a colonial electrical engineer. This is when electricity was just developing. He put in the systems in Gibraltar and Singapore. And he married one Ethel Sandeman in June 1896. The third son was Bertram, who became an admiral. And he wrote a very invaluable book for me. This book, which I'm holding up now, called Salt Junk, which was the story of his early life. And I'm really grateful to his grandson, Nicholas Chambers, who was very, very helpful in providing me with a lot of information about the family. And I believe Nicholas is watching tonight, and I'd just like to thank you, Nicholas, very much for your help. Then the first girl to be born was Margaret, or Margarita, and significantly she married one Reverend George Widborne. He had inherited from his father a substantial quantity of land in South London, and he also, interestingly, was a real expert in fossils. This was the time of Darwinism and so forth. You'll hear a lot more about him later. Then we come to Theodore. In fact, his first name was Walter, but that was dropped and he became Theodore, and he married Georgina Sandeman in April 1896, and she in fact is the sister of Ethel Sandeman, who married his older brother. Then the youngest daughter, of Charles, she married a rear admiral. Then their mother remarried, and she had Mr. Strong, and she had 2 boys, both of whom became vicars. So I hope you can see from this that they were all pretty brilliant children. And they were interested in the sciences, that's with electrical engineers. They were interested in the sea, Navy, that's Bertram. He was actually a navigator of a very technical post. And you'll hear more about some of these people later. So his early years. Right, well, I mentioned that his father wasn't a very successful barrister, but he did own a very large house in Belgravia, and every summer he used to let it out for the London season, and then so he would ship his family off, and sometimes they went up to Scotland, sometimes to Kent. Up in Scotland they visited Theodore's grandmother's house. That was the lady who was married to the man that died young in India. And she came back and she settled with her 2 daughters in somewhere called Rose Valley Cottage, and this is on the River Nairn. And eventually, after she died, the 2 daughters moved to this place, Polmay. It's now a bed and breakfast, and that is very near the place where Theodore is buried, and they are both buried in the same place as he is. Anyway, from going up to this place, he learned to fish, and here's some pictures of him fishing. Later on. He was also adventurous, like his mother, and these are shots of him mountaineering in Switzerland, I believe. So he was very keen on the open air. He was also artistic. A cousin, Augustus Hare, he of the rather fine moustache, taught him how to paint in watercolour, and the big picture of Karnak is one of the ones that he produced. one of the Colosseum is one that his cousin produced. He was a travel writer, among other things, and so that was a sample of his work. Now, this artistic influence, it runs deep in this family. His grandfather, during his brief life in India, took around a sketching book and drew watercolours of the places he saw. This was so interesting that they were acquired by the Victorian Albert, and they're now in there. That's an example of his work. His father may not have been a successful barrister, but he is known because he sketched, when he was at rugby school, the very first emanation of the game of rugby, and his sketches have been invaluable ever since. They're held at the school, showing how the game developed. Bertram Chambers, the Admiral, in his book Salt Junk, this is the opening frontispiece, and I'm afraid I haven't managed to reproduce it very well. It was rather more subtle than the way I've got it here, but also his book was illustrated by sketches and pencil sketches and so forth, but this was the watercolour on the front. So actually the art goes on in the family. Many members of it were artists, amateur, and there was at least one professional. This is Timothy Charles Plunkett Widbourne, who was a grandson of Bertram, and of Ida Widbourne, Reverend Widbourne and Margaret. I'll get it right in a minute. And he was very helpful to me because he provided me with a copy of this book, which is a history of something called GFW Estates, and that tells a lot more information about the family on that side. So I should say that unfortunately Timothy's recently died. I had a hope that he would be here now, but he was well into his 90s. Now, Sir Theodore trained in mining and then went to work in northern Spain, and this is a rather fine picture which of all these Spanish miners, with there he is in the centre, but looking rather dashing, I think. But he retrained, and the reason he retrained as a surveyor, in fact, that his brother-in-law, George Widbourne, the man who had inherited large parcels of land in South London from his father, in fact, his father was also a vicar, and he married into a Quaker family who, because they couldn't practice various professions, had become astute businessmen, and they built up this parcel of land, which came to him through his wife. Anyway, he asked Theodore to manage these estates for him, so Theodore retrained as a surveyor, and he won something called the Penfold Prize in 1895 as the best student. This is how one can waste time researching, because I wondered who Mr. Penfold was, and it turns out that he was the man who invented the hexagonal postbox in Victorian times. Anyway, there is Widbourne and there is Margaret. And this is a book that I referred to. On the front cover is a picture of Hammerwood House, which is where the Reverend Widbourne lived. And after he died, the estates were gathered together and formed into a private company with all the members of the family had relevant interest as directors. Theodore as the chairman, and he kept that role until his death in 1957, but he steered it all the way through. So this was a very important sideline, on a major part of his life, where he was running the family trusts. And a major building that the company carried out was in Larkhall Estate in South London. It opened in 1929, 308 flats for rental, and it was designed in part by Louis de Soissons, and you can see the neo-Georgian influence, and it was opened by Neville Chamberlain. And Sir Theodore wrote that this housing is within the range of a very large class of people in London for whom little or nothing has been done since the war. And basically they took some conventional houses, knocked them down, and built these sort of rectangular series of flats enclosing spaces. And what they were trying to do was get the same idea as being the courts of London, like Lincoln's Inn and so forth. Open space, but housing 3 times as many people as were there previously. And this was definitely in the spirit of Widbourne, who had tried very hard when he was alive to help all the people that lived on his land. And this was their idea of something that would be really pushing forward the idea of better housing for the poor in London. Anyway, back to his personal life. he married Gina in Sandeman in 1896. She, of course, was not just any old body. She was a descendant of Sandeman who'd started Sandeman Port. And she had 2 children, Holroyd and Gervase. And rather fine pictures, both of these, I think. Holroyd goes on to his father encouraged him to become a surveyor, and he was a successful one, and he worked his way up to be surveyor to the Duchy of Cornwall, and he had a member of the Victorian Order in 1950, which was upgraded to a companion, the Royal Victorian Order, in 1963. And this is his wife, then his fiancée, Miss Audrey Scott. This was from the Tatler in June 1930, January 1930. Anyway, electric cars. I didn't really know until I started researching this subject that electric cars, in fact, outsold the internal combustion engine cars in the very early parts of the 20th century. And one of the chief proponents was Thomas Edison. This is a picture of him in 1898 with the car in front of him stacked full of batteries. The reason they were very popular was that at that time roads were poor. Basically, you only drove cars really in cities. And there was a big snag with internal combustion engine that you had to have a really beefy chauffeur who could sort of wind the crank handle and start it up, so that it wasn't really great for most people. Theodore got interested in it, and he became director of something called the British and Foreign Electrical Vehicle Company. And this is a press cutting showing that he went on an experimental tour with an electric motor car through Gloucester. And this car was interesting. It says he was driven from London to Glasgow, taking part in trials at the Glasgow exhibition. And it holds the record for the longest distance on one charge, namely 96.5 miles. I should say I'm quite impressed with that, because I have quite a small electric car which doesn't actually go 96.5 miles on one charge. Anyway, the car, weighing 2 tons, has run 3,000 miles since June without a change of batteries. And the motion of the car is delightfully smooth, and there is little or no vibration or noise. And he went around racing it in Bexhill and doing all sorts of tours abroad as well as at home to promote it. And here he is, managing director of the Electromobile Company now in Hertford Street, Mayfair. That's a 1903 model on the left, which is still got, to me, echoes of a horse-drawn sort of carriage. And then 5 years later, a smaller version with what looks like a sort of windscreen for the passengers, which is become much more recognizable as a modern car. However, things were to change drastically. Well, first of all, the electric car business took a nosedive when, in 1912, somebody cleverly invented the starting motor. So instead of having to turn this crank handle at the front, all you had to do was press a button. And also roads were being greatly improved, and so longer distances were more feasible. Anyway, he turned his attention to tea and rubber. And he became chairman of a company that was floated in 1910 called the Peacock and Nilamby (Ceylon) Tea and Rubber Estates. And here's some pictures that were provided to me. This is a tea company. I think this is a tea warehouse. Looks under construction. And this is a rather fine shot of an elephant being used, I think, in the building of said construction. Now, how did he get involved in tea and rubber? Well, it's quite an interesting story. What happened was that a distant relative called Sir John Wilson had related to one of the Wilsons in his tree, had quite a strange life, and he was quite an ordinary sort of officer, but he was suddenly promoted to a leading role in Ceylon. At the same time, he took guardianship of somebody called George Lindsay as a baby, and who was born to a much younger woman who was a servant at St James's Palace. And when he died, he left his estates. He acquired significant tea estates when he was in Ceylon, and also London House, he left this all to this George Lindsay on condition that he changed his surname to Wilson. And George Lindsay, when he found out in the will that in fact he was the illegitimate son of General Wilson, it turned his mind, and he became, as it says here, a Folkestone hermit. And he basically didn't do anything. He just stayed inside houses, and then eventually just sort of passed away. And in fact, sometime, as his press cutting says, he was for a short time placed in a lunatic asylum. Anyway, because he died allegedly as being illegitimate, the whole of his estate, that was Sir John Wilson's tea estate, came to him. Came to the state. And then the state started casting around for who might have a legitimate claim on them. And all the time, the Chambers family thought that they had some claim on these estates. And they'd been communicating with him, and they felt that it was going to come to them eventually. Anyway, they now had to put up some reasons why they should have it, and there were various other claimants. But eventually, a large portion of them did come to the Chambers family, and Theodore, being the brightest in the family and also in a position to do so, took over the chairmanship of the company that was formed to run them. And so he actually spent a lot of his time promoting tea, and you'll see a bit more of that later on. But I think it's quite an interesting story as to. Oh, by the way, I should say that Bertram, writing in his book Junk Salt, reckons that what actually happened was that this chap, George Lindsay, wasn't actually Wilson's son. He thinks that it was something to do with a duke in St James's Palace, and that basically they persuaded Wilson to take charge of this boy, and that was why he got the rapid promotion into Ceylon. But who knows whether that's true or not. But anyway, the fact is that eventually his estates descended to the Chambers family. World War I. This is a picture of him in uniform in Brighton 1915. I'm not sure what the uniform is, but this is where he became very active in state affairs. He had stood as a prospective candidate for Sutherland, that's the red bit marked in northern Scotland, chiefly because of his links with Scotland. He stood for the Unionist Party. The Unionist Party was really the Conservative Party, but apparently in Scotland you couldn't stand as a Conservative, it was just not done, so he was a Unionist. He got on well, he became the candidate, and then the election was cancelled. But it shows that he was on the Conservative wing of politics. In the war, he became a volunteer, and he worked his way up to be the controller of the war savings movement. And this is an announcement in 1917. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has appointed Mr. Theodore Chambers as secretary to the committee of the war savings, and the committee has appointed him as controller, both offices unpaid. And it says that he acted as commissioner for the north of England from 1916 and director of external organisation in November the previous year. So he worked his way up, and he was tremendously active in promoting savings, public savings. I've read lots of press cuttings from the time, and he covered virtually the whole of the country, urging individual towns and cities, because it was all decentralised, the saving efforts, to really step up to the mark and get their targets in. Individuals were encouraged to save, because this helped the government to pay for the war. And there were two tactics used. One was appealing to our natural greed. So if you spent 15 and 6 on a war saving certificate, then in 5 years' time, at the end of the war, presumably, you'd get £1 back for it, which was a pretty good rate of return. And I was interested to know that there's a badge. I've got this little badge, and it says 15 and 6 at the top and £1 at the bottom, and with a swastika in the middle, which was, I suppose, a good luck symbol. However, after the rise of Hitler, the swastika was rapidly ditched as one of their logos. Now, the other, apart from appealing to their greed, the other one was appealing to their good nature. So here's some posters. Are you saving for the children? Save for their education. Better prospects in youth, greater comfort, buy saving certificates. And then this was an interesting one. The kitchen is the key to victory. Eat less bread. And there's an element of sort of hair-shirtedness about this. Chambers was constantly urging people to save on resources and put the money saved into war bonds, sweets, cut down sweets and all that. So that was the another element to his campaign. But he was very, very active, and for his pains he was made a knight at the end of the war. He didn't just do that, actually. He pursued other activities during the war. He was an active member of the Eugenics Society. His wife was the secretary. Now, eugenics has got rather a bad press after Hitler came to power and started applying it in rather bad ways, but it was extremely popular as a movement around the time that of the First World War. Quite a lot of leading people supported the idea that you should try and improve the physical and mental state of the race by doing positive social action. And in this case, Chambers was saying, well, he wrote a pamphlet, actually, which I got a copy of here, called Eugenics and the War. It's quite an interesting read, because he talks about the war. Is it going to be a good thing or a bad thing? I think for eugenics, but he concludes it's probably going to be a bad thing. First of all, a lot of as he would put it, the finest people, the officers, that would be killed. And also he thought that it would hit particularly the middle classes who were left at home, actors and other professionals who wouldn't have any work to do. I mean, there are echoes here of the COVID problem, when actors and other creative people were put out of work because the theatres were closed down. And he was very worried about this, because he thought this would cut down they would stop having children and so forth, and it would cut down their contribution to the race in general. He was pleased that the Archbishop of Canterbury, this is what it says in his article, is reducing marriage fees, because he thought it was much better that troops married rather than to resort to other undesirable forms of sexual outlet. And he also started a fund to fight poverty among professionals. That's on the right-hand side. You can see he was the secretary. So he tried to do active steps to further the cause of eugenics. And actually, this is quite relevant to what went on later on, because, for example, when he was in charge of Welwyn Garden City, he introduced a scheme whereby if you rented a house and you had children, then the rent would go down, because he felt that this was a direct way of encouraging people to have children in Welwyn Garden City. Also, he wrote quite a big paper for the Surveyors Institution in January 1917, and this was about repopulation of our rural districts. He presented it to them, and I had quite a struggle with getting this paper, because the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, which took over the Surveyors Institution because of COVID, took the opportunity to close down their library, and as not reopened. And I couldn't get access to the records in January 1917, but happily an Indian publishing firm sell copies of the transactions, and they sell them in the form of a rather fine leather-bound book. And so I was able to get access to what he wrote, and it's very interesting. He was concerned about movement away from rural areas to cities, and he said that rural communities were being sidelined politically, because they were being swamped by the people moving to the cities and having much more political clout. And he also thought, again going back to eugenics, that city populations were less healthy than rural ones. He thought that he looked at men and thought they were rather weedier in cities than they were in the country. And in fact, he found out that quite a few people in the cities were refused entry to the forces because they weren't healthy enough. And also food security was threatened, because cities just imported food en masse and they didn't grow it themselves. And food security became a big thing during the First World War, because suddenly we thought we were going to be cut off from food. And he recommended, I'm really simplifying a long paper, he recommended better transport links to rural areas, because he thought that would be a way to get economic activity going there. He also encouraged, this is quite important, industrial enterprises to expand in rural areas. And he then also thought that there should be greater devolution of power to rural communities in general. Now, he didn't refer to the garden cities. He said, in the garden city conception, there lay much wisdom. And it's been unfortunate that the Garden City movement has so largely developed into little more than the construction of garden suburbs. The slow rate of growth of Letchworth proves the extreme difficulty of endeavouring to force human movements in the presence of adverse economic factors. Now, this paper was noted by one Norman Saville. Saville was the man who'd acted for Ebenezer Howard in buying the land on which Welwyn Garden City was to be built. In fact, he was actually lent Ebenezer Howard £250 because Howard didn't have enough money to pay even the deposit on the land that he'd bought. And that Norman Saville went along and introduced Sir Theodore to Ebenezer Howard on the basis of this paper. So you could say that had it not been for Norman Saville, and his firm goes on today as Saville's, well-known estate agents, if it hadn't been for Norman Saville, then you might not have Welwyn Garden City. And now at last, finally, I'm sure to the relief of many people here, we get to Welwyn Garden City itself. I thought the background was interesting, though, because it showed where Chambers was coming from. He had theoretical views about population growth, improving the nation, better housing. He hated London, by the way, because he said it was terrible. The slums in London were shocking, and he wanted to improve generally the lot of humanity living in our country. So, quick recap. Ebenezer Howard's vision 1902. He wanted self-sustaining garden cities. He wanted land owned by the community, not by individuals. He wanted workers living close to their work. He wanted food grown around the perimeter so that the garden cities would be self-sufficient. And importantly, he wanted social classes to be mingled. And that was the book he published at the time. His vision, I'm sure you're familiar with this, he didn't just envisage one garden city, but a whole series of them. This is obviously just a diagram, but they're linked together by a railway line. And so you didn't have to have one, you had a whole grouping of them. Now, each individual garden city was, there was a central point with a railway line running round and then carrying on connecting to all the other ones. And in the outskirts, you had agricultural colleges, new forests, convalescent homes, farms, brickfields, all the things you do in the cow pastures. And then in the inner side, you had this sort of activity. You had grand boulevards dividing the city. You had a central hub where you had things like libraries and town halls, a park. Then you had a Crystal Palace, which of course was for shopping, houses. Then this grand avenue with the school, more shopping. And then around the outside, you had all the things that were going to provide employment. And then eventually you had all the farms, dairy farms, allotments and wells on the outside. So this was his schematic plan for what a garden city should look like. But in 1919, he suddenly had the opportunity to buy land at auction in Hertfordshire, which he'd seen a lot. He went over a railway line that passed right over it every day on his way to work. He walked the land. He had identified it already as a suitable site, and then suddenly it became available to him at auction. And he rushed ahead without telling too many people, and he bought some land because he wanted to push ahead and create a second garden city. He set up a Pioneer Second Garden City Limited, and he then, after Saville's introduction, asked Sir Theodore to act as its chairman. Next year, 29th of April 1920, this was succeeded by Welwyn Garden City Limited, which was a property developer, again with Sir Theodore as chairman. Sir Theodore, wanted to appoint architects, a town planner, and no one was suitable. So Sir Theodore, approached the chairman of the architects, or RIBA, on a personal basis, and this chap recommended Louis de Soissons, and he passed all the tests with flying colours, bright young man, and was appointed in April 1920 as architect and town planner. Same time, someone called Charles B. Purdham was appointed finance director, and Frederick Osborne, who later became Sir Frederick Osborne, was the secretary. And those two chaps both came from Letchworth, and they were basically Ebenezer Howard's protégés. And the first house was occupied just before Christmas 1920. And this is a very famous master plan that de Soissons drew up in 6 weeks from his appointment. And you can see that you've got railway lines, key railway lines running through it. This, of course, fitted in with Chambers' idea, by the way, of having better transport links to rural areas. And so you're going to have housing here. On the west side, on the east side, you were going to have industry. The reason you have put it there is that the prevailing winds would blow all the smoke away from the houses, and the sewage works would be up here. De Soissons had some ideas to work on that had been given to him, but this was entirely his creation. And this is the very well-known plan that's become an international template for developing such areas. Well, what did Chambers do? First of all, he persuaded Midland Bank to provide an overdraft of £125,000, and despite its chairman's scepticism, I should say that Barclays, who were the main bankers to the company, had set such onerous conditions that he didn't think that they could meet them. So he persuaded the chairman of the Midland Bank to come out to Welwyn Garden, and he looked around. He said, "I think you might be able to build 200, 300 houses." But anyway, Theodore massaged him. Eventually, they had the loan given to them, which enabled them to buy the land in full and then move ahead. I'm not sure the Midland Bank really thanked him for this, because they got sucked into more and more finance, because finance was a tremendously big problem right from the outset. Anyway, Chambers then made another important step and said he was only going to have quality. He employed top experts in every field, planning, surveying, and so forth. He wasn't going to make do with any amateur stuff. And Osborne, writing of it later, had a rather dismissive comment, or rather grouchy type of comment. He said, "Chambers had a Rolls-Royce outlook compared with the modest pedestrian or Tin Lizzie aspirations to which we Letchworthians had been conditioned." Seems to me he was feeling already a bit beaten down. And almost immediately, Chambers dropped Howard's basic premise that profits on land following a change of use, that is from agriculture to houses, Howard said that basically the whole thing could be funded because capital gains on land would be used by the company to develop the whole enterprise, and it wouldn't go to individuals. However, this was dropped by Chambers because no one was going to buy a house if they thought in the end any capital gain would be transferred away from them. In fact, the idea was originally that they'd sign leases with a variable amount of rent, which could be put up sort of indefinitely to unstated amounts, depending on how the land went. So they couldn't actually sell any houses to anybody under those conditions, and so that whole basic idea was dropped. Instead, he set up a series of subsidiary companies to do everything that was required to build the city and run it, with monopolies. And so any profits were retained within the city. So building, baking, brick making, nurseries, retailing, theatres, transport, provision of electricity, everything was done by companies run entirely from the centre. And a very important step, in 1923, Chambers supported de Soissons' request that de Soissons should be put in overall control of design, so that if you built anything in Welwyn Garden City, it had to be approved by de Soissons. And a director, Richard Rice, wrote to Chambers saying, "I cannot consent to have de Soissons acting as a dictator on matters of taste. He has delayed building, caused a large amount of friction. If a young superman is to come and impose his will on us and stop work, I, for one, shall have to resign." Well, de Soissons carried on. Rice didn't resign. In fact, he became a very long-standing director, and he transferred to the New Towns after the war. And in hindsight, this overall design philosophy was one of the most positive planning lessons from Welwyn Garden City. And anyone who lives in the city must, I'm sure, appreciate the unity of the design behind the city. Chambers himself moved into 9 Gessens Road. This is a contemporary picture of it now. In fact, all the key people moved into Gessens Road, a very important road. In fact, Chambers actually persuaded one of his nephews, Bertram, to move into Welwyn Garden City, and he came to High Oaks Road. So it was important that the directors lived in the city and experienced its growth and the problems associated with it. This is a picture of Gessens Road. In fact, right down the end is where Howard lived and also where Chambers lived down on this right-hand side. But you can see when it was built, they put the houses up. They didn't bother with pavements or tarmac or anything like that. But houses had to be built. Excuse me. Anyway, this is a picture of the board in 1928 at the opening of the theatre cinema. And this, of course, is Ebenezer Howard. He died within a few months of this picture. And there is Chambers. There is actually Richard Rice, the chap who said he would resign if Soissons had his way, because he hadn't. There is de Soissons. Here is Purdham, who had become in charge of finance director, had taken over control of almost everything, and right at the back here is Osborne, the company secretary. So this is quite an interesting photo. You can see these are not ordinary people. There was a problem, though. There were different objectives. Howard had his scheme, his utopian scheme of a city where all the gains would go to the city, and it was a liberal objective, and it was fully backed up by Purdham and by Osborne. It was not fully backed up by Chambers, because he was wrestling with the reality of making this city work. So there were tensions. Finance was a terrible problem right from the word go, and they tried issuing shares. No one bought them. The directors ended up by buying them themselves. Continual struggles over finance. The problem was, you see, that no one buying houses, they rented them. And how do they finance continued growth of these houses? And it went on and on for years and years. And also there was an organizational problem. Chambers was not a manager. He was an inspirational type, but he didn't like running things particularly. He wasn't very good at it. And so they had a rather hybrid structure with there was no one in overall control. So this gave rise to all sorts of issues. Anyway, the whole thing began to fall apart. Purdham left very shortly after this picture was taken. The other key directors all banded together and said, look, Purdham is just too dictatorial. We can't take it anymore. He's got to go. Of course, Chambers, oh no, how did he handle this? He sort of tried wriggling around, finding alternatives, but in the end, Purdham had to go. And in fact, I was speaking only recently to someone who met Purdham quite a few times and said that actually, of all these people here, Purdham was the most brilliant. He was very keen on acting and plays, drama. He had all sorts of interests. But he actually had no training for the job that he was in. He'd left school fairly early, and so he was in completely the wrong post. Howard dies very shortly after that. So there's the sort of the profit going. And then lastly, Osborne, in 1935, suddenly and mysteriously leaves the company. So those are all the people, the key people carrying forward the grand idea of the Howard's utopia gone. Osborne's rather a strange sort of reason for leaving. He went to work as an emergency thing with Murphy's, and then he went on to great things with the Town and Country Planning Association when he got a knighthood up. So his career certainly wasn't damaged, but it's very strange why he left here. There was no clear reason. I believe, judging from comments that people have made, he may have experienced something similar to Matt Hancock, but I have no concrete proof for that, but there was something of that in it. So on went the work, and the first thing they were doing was concentrating on building houses. And here's an interesting shot for those of you who live in Welwyn Garden City. This is Valley Road running up here. There's the railway line in the distance. You can see it running down there. Nothing over there. There is Gessens Road, the road I was talking to you about, where all the directors lived. And so you can see that this is the area they concentrated on developing, and nothing over on this side at all. That's in 1924. 1926, good news. They at last get a major employer on board, Shredded Wheat. And this was a key move. Shredded Wheat moved there because they liked the green image of Welwyn Garden. They were a Canadian firm, and they prided themselves on the quality of their produce. And so here was literally a greenfield site. They could use cereals from East Anglia, and it was just the right image for them. So they became major employers. And you can see how well placed the factory was, because here's the main LNER railway line going through the middle, of which these two branch lines ran. One to Luton and the other one to Hertford, and there were sidings that were coming in off the Hertford line, perfectly placed to deliver cereals to the factory. So it was an ideal arrangement for them. 1926, they actually, LNER, build a station, and here is Neville Chamberlain. You remember he opened the Larkhall estate a couple of years later for Chambers. Obviously he had close relationship with Chambers, who persuaded him to come along and do the grand opening. But that was a real key moment. 1928, I always think this is a very interesting picture. It shows they're now beginning to develop the land between the houses on one side of the parkway, which is this big central boulevard, and they're now beginning to gradually work down into this area here. There's the station, there's the railway line, and this is what's Howard's Gate, another sort of boulevard area where they're going to build shops and so forth. And they put in as a sort of cultural icon, this is a theatre cinema, very grand, very large, but you can, much larger than was justified by the population at the time, but you can see they had great ambitions, cultural ambitions. And this is Parkway, and you remember I showed you earlier on that where Chambers, the monument to Chambers that is where it is today. That's where its site is. And this is an interesting view looking down Howard's Gate. Just shortly after that picture was taken, de Soissons designed this Barclays Bank building, which he wanted to set as the architectural tone for the whole of Howard's Gate. It would be Barclays, that were their bankers, of course, but on the other side, opposite, on the other side of Howard's Gate, there was the Midland Bank as well. And this shows how the shredded wheat factory was so prominent in the view of the city. There's a new station tucked away down there, and here is the shredded wheat factory. And there's a lot of controversy at the moment as to what's to replace the site all over there, but I'm sure we'll hear more of that later. This site has been completely emptied now, except for some 4 silos and this building, which is now in ruins, virtually. And 1928, there's some more things going on. The British Instructional Film Studio was built, rather a nice picture, I think, of it, just down the road from shredded wheat. And also there were sectional factories being built, which was very important, because de Soissons' idea was if you put factories up that were could be used for a variety of purposes, that would encourage young entrepreneurs to bring their companies into Welwyn Garden, so they could do with them what they liked. And it worked. In 1929, this is again the sketch plan. There's the shredded wheat factory, and that's the film place. But they had all these firms suddenly turning up. And of course, you had, as I said, the Welwyn Garden City Laundry and Bakery, which was owned by the company, and the electricity station. But you also had various other companies as well. Barclay Corsets from America. Very fine Art Deco building, no longer there, Bicky Pegs and so forth. And also, very importantly, down here, the Murphy Radio Company. He went to having from one, Frank Murphy started off building radios in his garage, then he bought a sectional building, and then he eventually had 27 sectional buildings, and eventually they built a whole brand new complex just for themselves. So it just shows what you could do with the land that Welwyn Garden City provided. This is a picture of 1935 of Sir Theodore in the front garden, or back garden, not sure, of his house in Guessed's Road. And this is Holroyd, and this is Holroyd's 2 children, Anne and Quintin. So the company really sort of begins to succeed in building up a city, but then in 1949, after the war, Labour government comes in and takes over the whole thing. And Welwyn Hatfield New Town was created, Welwyn Garden City Limited was wound up, and Chambers apart from being the first, was also the last chairman. But he did a very good deal in negotiating good terms for the buyout, so that he actually succeeded in helping all the people that had backed the company through rocky times into getting them a fair return when the government took them over. And in 1942-43, a house that was important to the Grant clan near Loch Ness was sold off. A house that he knew well, and he couldn't buy what he was hoping to up there, so he bought a plot of land from the estate when it was broken up, and he built a cottage, Loch Letter Cottage. And this is a shot of the family. This is Holroyd now. This is after the war sometime or other. There is the Theodore with his wife, and there's Holroyd's wife, and here we have Anne, quite a lot older than we saw her last, and there's Quintin. I hope you like this, Quintin. Almost a year ago, I went up there to inspect the ground, and here's my long-suffering wife standing by the little loch on which Loch Letter Cottage was on the banks of which Loch Letter Cottage was built, just as helped Sir Theodore do his fishing. And this is a movie of his Chambers. After he's got in 1949, he's free of the company. He makes a trip to Canada to visit his other son Geoffrey, who's moved out to Vancouver Island. And this is a home movie, which I'm quite pleased to have got. It was, what happened was Geoffrey and his wife moved out to this remote island, to a place called Forbidden Plateau, and his wife took some 16mm home, or I think it was 8mm home videos, and when they died they had no children, and the trustee of their affairs left them to the British Columbian state government, who in turn donated them to the Canadian government. So they, all their home movies now are stored in a super high security depository in Ottawa. Anyway, getting them out of here was quite a challenge through COVID, but I've finally managed to persuade them to make a digital copy. And this is an 11-minute video cut down to a minute, showing the bits that Theodore appears in. Now, this is this so-called place they bought called Forbidden Plateau, which was turned into a trekking centre. And this is the Theodore, obviously, and this is Geoffrey, and they're off to some hut somewhere or other. There is Sir Theodore. You can see the sort of terrain that they're in, quite mountainous and snowy. He always smoked. This is a shot of him smoking. He was always impeccably dressed as well. And this is him with Geoffrey surveying the territory. I wish I could be a lip reader. I'd be lovely to know what they were saying. This is him with Geoffrey and his daughter-in-law. My son helpfully helped to edit this to make it into a reasonable sort of cut of 11 minutes down to 1. And this, I think, is a really charming picture of them showing a happy couple. Anyway, final resting place. Sir Theodore died in Exmouth. Basically, he and his wife sort of retired to a hotel in Exmouth. And he died on the 20th of November 1957. And because of his Scottish links, he'd asked that he should be buried in the Grant graveyard in a place called Drumnadrochit, just near Loch Letter Cottage. And David Fraser will explain to you, I think, the significance of all this. And this is what it looks like now. There's he is here, and his wife, who died 3 years later, is just underneath him. Very sort of small plaque set in the corner. These are all other significant grants. It's in pretty good condition now, but at one stage it looked like that. A total wreck. Basically, since it was a private graveyard and no one lived anywhere near it, it began to fall into disuse. This was, when my wife and I went up there, this was the state of it. Almost entirely down to David Fraser, they started renewing it. I should say thank you to my wife, because she's been so noble in following me around on all these sort of research trips. Very unfortunately, shortly after this picture was taken, she slipped on a steep woodland path, and she ended up with me in accident and emergency in Inverness with a bad cut on her forehead. But anyway, happily she's recovered now. But I must say thank you very much to her for putting up with me in these sort of chases. Anyway, this was now this is a drone shot by David's son of he ran a drone over the top of the graveyard, and this is very good to show you the sort of where it is, miles from anywhere, and sort of rather on the edge of Drumnadrocket, Rocket. But you get a good idea of the scale of it. It's only a very small place, but it's so good that David is restoring it and bringing it back to what its original position would have been. He's done this obviously with quite a lot of help and grants and so forth, but he has been the personal driver to get this thing restored. So top marks to him. So, writing in the Times after Theodore died, Osborne, who'd been sacked by him, and Rice, who'd both of them knew him very well, wrote this charming letter to the Times. And it said, joining Sir Ebenezer Howard's small group in 1919, he was chairman of Welwyn Garden City Limited till the town was taken over under the New Towns Act in 1948. To finance and build an entirely new town on a virgin site by private enterprise, when public opinion was indifferent, city circles highly sceptical, and the government unhelpful, seemed next to impossible. It would not have been accomplished but for Sir Theodore's extraordinary enthusiasm. This is my bold typing. Extraordinary enthusiasm, energy, and powers of persuasion. The economic structure of the town owes much to his profound knowledge and original thinking on land values, and its layout, architecture, and landscaping to his imaginative understanding of the relationship of social and aesthetic factors. He was a man of wide culture, lively receptivity to ideas, and great personal charm. And living in the town throughout the 28 years of his chairmanship, he was one of the most influential leaders in its social and local government activities. To Chambers, as to Howard, the building of Welwyn Garden City was never merely an end in itself, but an object lesson for future developments. And I think that very much summed up his contribution. It was a very fair reading of what he'd managed to achieve. So I just conclude that, do you remember this photo that I showed you earlier on, 1928-29? Well, that's what it looks like now. Obviously, Welwyn Garden City has thrived. It's hugely increased in size thanks to becoming a new town and so forth. But the railway station's gone to be replaced by a shopping centre, including a railway station. You can just see shredded wheat over the back of one of those trees, and the Coronation Fountain here, 1953. But anyway, it's now a thriving city, and it's I'm sure everyone knows about its contention is that without Chambers, this would not have been achieved. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if I can do that, and I'll ask the other panelists if they'd be so kind as to switch on their videos and unmute themselves, and we're going to have a little discussion about what I've just said. And first of all, I'm going to ask Quintin if he's got any comments on the film or anything that he'd like to add about his grandfather. Quintin, over to you, all the way from Hawaii. I mean, isn't this wonderful? Don't you think that thanks to Zoom we can talk?
It's amazing. It's really amazing. Yes, I talk to people all over the world through the Zooms and webinars and Skyping. Well, Geoffrey, I am impressed. You've done a fine job, a really fine job putting together a biography of my grandfather. When I knew him, I was a child and just in my school years, and to me and my sister, I think the grandparents were simply granddad and grandmother. And we had no idea, we knew something about what you've been talking about, but we never realized that he was really quite somebody fairly important. And he was just a very nice person to have around the place. He was easy to get along with, and it was fun to be with him. But you've opened my eyes anyway to many things I never knew about it, particularly the tea industry and the creation of Welwyn Garden City. I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank people involved in your talk. I'm glad Nicholas Chambers became involved with this. I was hoping he would, and
you told me, Quintin, about you recalled going up to Scotland to fish with him, didn't you? I was rather enjoyed your recollection of how you travelled up to fish with him when you were a lad.
Oh well, yeah, we took the night train from Euston up to Inverness. It took all night to get to Inverness at that time, and my parents and my sister and I, we had a cabin with bunks, and the grandparents had a first-class cabin. And I remember that he was addressed as my lord by the conductor of the train. It wasn't my lord, but that's how they addressed it. Anyway, when we went up with him, I think we went to Loch Leta. And then we fished on Loch Ness and possibly on Loch Meakley. Loch Meakley is the loch really adjacent to the cottage that he built. And he tried to stock that with trout. But at one time, I think the pike were too numerous, and I don't know if it was successful or not. But yeah, this is after the war. We went, up to Loch Leta and enjoyed staying with him there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Actually, maybe David, you could sort of fill us in a bit more of the history of the grants and Loch Leta and so forth, because I know you know a lot more about it than I do. But the graveyard, I think I was correct in saying it's all down to you. Am I not correct?
It's a team effort, but certainly I've been. I was asked about 20 years ago to take on the project, which says something about my speed of work. But it's actually been quite a coincidence how everything has been coming together this last couple of years. The work that you're doing on Sir Theodore down there, plus what we've been doing. But to answer your question, Quintin, it's still full of pike. There are some brown trout, but not many. So I don't recommend coming up for the fishing at Loch Meakley. So just to, it was very clear from what I've researched that Sir Theodore Chambers had a real passion for the grant history, and that particular branch of the grants, it goes back to 1509 when King James IV of Scotland granted Achard Castle to the grants. And that was because he was wanting somebody to take control of the difficult people that live in this area, probably myself included, or my ancestors. And the grants then, they started off at Coromoni, which is at the very top of the glen, and then built Shughley, which is at the far end of Loch Meakley to Loch Leta. The grants of Shughley took part in Culloden, including a direct relative of Sir Theodore or his wife, and the Jacobite soldier who survived. But after Culloden, they lost everything because they had been inside of Bonnie Prince Charlie. The houses they had were destroyed. But within about 50 years, the family had gone to India. I was interested about the Chambers connections with India, but the grants had also gone there separately, and they made a fortune. I'll not go into how they made a fortune, but they did. And in 1800, they got permission to build the cemetery where it is. It was all around where an ancestor had been buried in 1689. So the the cemetery was very much full of grants, and there are many stories about them. But in the 1940s, for Theodore, as we heard, he used to come up. He built a house at Loughletter, and he would come up for the fishing. I believe that he would have been a friend also of Sir Charles Grant, who is also related to the Grants of Shugley. And he was in charge of the army in Scotland at the start of the Second World War. And he had a house at the other side of the loch from Loughletter. And we've got evidence that apart from both having a great love for fishing, they also had this, the history going back, and they undertook repairs at that time to the graveyard. And a graveyard that hadn't been used for many years. Then we had the burial of Sir Charles Grant, Sir Theodore Chambers, and two other local people who again were related to them. I'll not take up your time tonight, but to give you an idea of the importance of some of these grants, at one of the funerals, there was 3,000 people turned up. It took several days to find some of the men afterwards. One was found sleeping at the bottom of a waterfall where no sane person could have got. So I suspect that he had partaken of a couple of whiskies over the 3 days.
It could have been the waterfall that my wife and I were visiting, where she slipped off the. We never got to that waterfall, but anyway,
Yes,
sorry.
it would have been Geoffrey Falls.
Yes.
So it was not a safe place to go. But there are so many stories. But Sir Theodore certainly helped in the 40s to restore the site, and that's what we've been taking it on again since then. Just some background to those connections to the North Scotland.
Thank you very much, Tony. Tony, I don't know if you wanted to say anything on the accuracy or otherwise of my comments about Welwyn Garden City. I mean, I don't. I'm not as expert on it as you are, but I don't know if I got anything wrong or not. But anyway, if you have anything to sort of contribute, I'd be pleased to hear it.
Perish the thought, Geoffrey. Perish the thought. I've certainly learned some things which I didn't know, and on the whole, I don't think I've disagreed with you more than a couple of times, and on minor matters. So well done, you, and thank you, because this has proved very clearly what an extraordinary figure Chambers was, and how absolutely critical he was to the creation and preservation and development of Welwyn Garden City. And yet, hardly anybody in the town until now knew anything about him. So I hope this has put things right. And thank you very much for that.
Okay. Okay, thank you. We've got some questions and answers. I mean, Frank, have you got anything that you feel we should concentrate on?
Yes, we're a bit light on questions, so I just want to say to people, that's just my mistake, actually. I did my housekeeping at the beginning, everything except one thing I forgot to mention, but it's open now. At the bottom of your screens is a Q&A button, and you're very welcome to submit a question. So while we go through the one question I have, which is really a comment, and also another comment from my other half, and a question from my other half. Here, I'll ask these. So here is a question, more like comment from Clive Wilson that you can see. The electric car in the early 1900s was finished off by the cheaper Model T Ford. See this program. What I'm going to do is, because none of the others of you can actually see this comment, I'm going to post it into the general chat, and you're all very welcome. I won't play the program, but you're all very welcome to actually watch that in the chat. So here we go. If you look at your chats at the bottom, you'll see the number has increased, and you can copy this out and onto your clipboard. You can even paste it into your browser. I suggest you hang in there with us for the moment. So there we are. So question from my other half, who's downstairs. Lorraine says, how did the other WGC developers know Chambers? So can I offer that to someone in the panel who would like to take that up?
Well, when you say the other developers, I'm not sort of entirely sure. I know from talking to people one person in particular who, as I say, knew Purdham and knew Osborne extremely well, that there were tensions at the board level, and I think that the developers chiefly were the builders and so forth. The architects were all selected by de Soissons, so he was the one that went out and got teams of practices to build things. He was the driving force behind the construction on the ground, although Chambers did actually put some artistic input into it over things like Parkway and so forth, as I understand it. But as I say, he was an inspirational character and a leading figure, and he also was very well connected, but he basically used de Soissons to do all the work.
And also, of course, don't forget that a lot of the people who were involved in the early stages were involved with Letchworth. So we mustn't forget that Welwyn Garden City is undoubtedly the finest garden city ever built, but certainly isn't the first. Letchworth came first and continues to be very proud of it, and so it should be. Yes. But a lot of the connections there, you mentioned them early on, Geoffrey, one or two of the people who came from Letchworth, and that link continued right the way through. And there was a sort of almost a garden city underground operating at that time. There were links back to places like Bourneville, Port Sunlight, and places of that ilk, Saltaire and such like, all of which had been developed by what you might call the social reforming group of people. So there's a long history going back, all of which had its own connections. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Well, I think it's probably time that we sort of wound up now.
Geoffrey, just couple more questions have come in while you've been doing that, so it won't take too long. This one, fascinating talk. Thank you for your rigour, Geoffrey, and to David for honouring Sir Theodore's memory. Interesting thought. Would WGC have happened without the gravitas of Chambers?
I personally, I don't think. I think it would not have happened, because, as I mentioned earlier, he managed to persuade the chairman of Midland Bank to cough up this money against the man's better judgment. Barclays already put sort of conditions on it that were not possible to meet. So no, I think Chambers was the ideal man with the right contacts, and it's hard to conceive of any other. And also, he had the philosophical drive. It wasn't just a business thing. He was doing something he believed in. So the combination of all these factors, I think, meant that he was the right person in the right job. And I can't conceive of anyone else that would have had all those contacts and those qualities. He was a chartered surveyor. Do you see what I mean? He knew all about land, and he had a lot of things going for him. And it's hard to think that there'd been someone who could have taken over that role. So I think without him, it wouldn't have happened, I don't think.
No, I mean, before myself and Geoffrey managed to make contact, I'd also been doing research on Sir Theodore as one of our key figures in the graveyard, and I just felt, as Sir Theodore has said, not Sir Theodore, as Geoffrey has said, that everything, all the man's experience that he had gained over the years came together along with his vision, and the Garden City movement was, it needed somebody with his connections, with his experience, with his drive, and sheer determination to achieve that. I've never been down to the Garden City, but hopefully one day this COVID will make travel much easier, and we'll get down. Love to see the place. Thank you.
You'd be very, very welcome, David. Very welcome.
There was a good question just popped up then. I don't know if you saw it, Quintin. Did you see the thing that just popped up then?
Well, we'll read it out for Quintin. The question, it says, "Hello, Quintin.
Yes.
How young are you? We'll leave you to whether you want to answer that. Did I hear you are in Hawaii? But I think the most important part of the question is, how did you end up there? So you're in Hawaii, how did you end up there? And if you wish to answer the question, how young are you?
Okay. In 1961, I went to Japan, and I was teaching English language at different places and also studying martial arts. And in what my training partner suggested that we open a martial arts school on the big island of Hawaii. So in 1973, I moved to Hawaii and I opened a martial arts school, and I've been here ever since, teaching English language and also teaching martial arts. That's in a nutshell.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Quintin. And this question from someone you might know.
Excuse me, Frank. Sorry to interrupt, but the question was for one Clive Wilson.
Oh, I missed that, from Clive Wilson. Indeed.
So I imagine you know Clive, Quintin.
Clive Wilson?
Yes, I think so. Is he one of the Wilson? Oh no. All right. Okay. Well, anyway. Okay.
No,
No.
Well, Clive, if you are one of the Wilsons, please put that in the chat. In the meantime, we move to a comment and a question from Nicholas Chambers, who Quintin will know, or at least know of, but probably know. So first of all, Nicholas says, "Brilliant talk. So well done, Geoffrey." And the question then is to all of you: what was the general funding model? Who would like to take that question up? What was the general funding model?
Well, as I mentioned, that they originally thought that they got the loan from the bank that enabled them to pay for the land and so forth, and then they started issuing shares because they thought that this funding model from would give them cash to expand. But unfortunately, nobody bought them. They had a limit on the dividends of, I think, interest of 7% or something like that, and people just didn't think that was enough, because if you remember, this is just after World War I, inflation was high and so forth, so they couldn't sell them. The directors had to dig into their own pockets to stump up cash, and then Midland Bank kept on lending them more and more money, and so the funding model just didn't. And as I think I mentioned, when they were going to sell houses, they thought they could put ground rents on, long leases with ground rents, and the ground rents would be moved upwards over time, and that would bring Howard's vision of the gain from the property being shifted into the centre. But that model just didn't work, because no one was going to buy a house with that sort of lease. So those I hope that's answered your question, Nicholas. But the funding models that they had just failed utterly, and which is one of the reasons why they had to shift over to running everything as a monopoly and not allowing competition. No other stores were allowed except Welwyn stores, and so forth. No pubs other than the ones they ran themselves. So that was the alternative funding model they adopted. Essentially, it was which, interestingly enough, doesn't really fit in with Chambers' conservative ideals of free trade and all that stuff, does it? He, in fact, eventually resorted to what's happened in COVID, because the circumstances were so drastic that they had to impose severe controls on people's freedom in order to weather the storm. I should say I completely forgot to point out this object. This is something I found at the graveyard up in Drummond and Drocket. It was a bit of marble off the edge, which I should hasten to say was no longer in use. But I should always treasure this as a memory of a trip to his graveyard. Anyway, okay.
So Geoffrey, that is it. There are no more questions. Well, I said that, and one popped in. Thank you for a great presentation. I was surprised that it did not include the classic STC photo, walking the estate before the development, now the old drive in WTC, worth circulating afterwards. Well, I'll tell you what, if someone locates that for me, I'll try and get it into one of the follow-up emails that go out at the end. So thank you for that. That's Clive, I believe, again. So if we can find that, we will. Other than that, that is the end of the questions, Geoffrey.
Well, okay, so I think we probably finished. The participants are slowly dropping in numbers. So I'll share my screen and I'll switch myself off, and I'm hoping that I can to switch to our next concluding remarks, if it works. No. Well, Tony, I'm afraid you'll have to. I thought I could switch to a final screen which said thank you so much, everybody, and now over to Tony for some concluding remarks. But I think you'll just have to say that that screen's not around. So over to you. I'm going to switch off my video now and leave it to you. Thanks for your help.
One glitch is neither here nor there, Geoffrey. Anyhow, that brings us to the end of this evening, and we hope that you've learned a lot about our third man and the huge debt that Welwyn Garden City owes to his skill and dedication. This evening's presentation has been recorded, and an edited version will be available shortly, as Frank mentioned earlier. If you're not familiar with Welwyn Garden City Heritage Trust, I'd like to give you a very brief outline. It's a registered charity, a not-for-profit company, founded 15 years ago in 2006. We don't have members, relying entirely on what we can earn from sales of our books, sponsorship, and financial donations. By the weekend coming, we should have a bank facility which will allow payments and donations to be made by credit card. So if you feel an interest in supporting us financially, we'd be delighted to hear from you. We have supporters and contacts across the world, provide talks for local schools, residents, professional planners, foreign visiting delegations, and have made occasional visits overseas to promote Welwyn Garden City. We also have now a wide range of books available about the town from us directly or from Waterstones in Welwyn Garden City. If you'd like to help with our work, there are lots of options available. Regular donations would obviously be nice, but personal involvement is particularly helpful as we restart the efforts to research the history of Welwyn Garden City and its people. Project activities can include recording interviews of residents' memories, promoting the trust via social media, analysing data collected, booking and recording details of gifts, etc., and running public exhibitions, which are great fun. We need anything from occasional help at events like tonight up to joining us as a trustee director. To find out more, please make contact via our website, www.wellinggarden-heritage.org, or Facebook page. Thank you for your company. Please keep in touch and help us bring the past into the future.